What's going on, everybody? Happy Friday. It's been forever since I've jumped on here with you guys. So I apologize. I have been out of town. So I apologize. I should have taken care of that. I should have done better. So I apologize right up front. But thanks for jumping in. Thanks for joining me today. I'm excited to share a little bit. Been working with a couple of churches, and one of the things um, is that a couple of churches that I've been working with are using an assessment called the Culture Index. Okay. So I don't know too much about it. It looks pretty awesome, looks pretty fantastic. I'm about to take the assessment myself. So I'll have more updates for you once I take that assessment. But Culture Index, I've heard of it a little bit, but these guys are using it, so I'm going to need to jump in, learn it, take it myself, kind of dive in. It looks a little bit like DISC, and as you guys know, I use DISC quite a bit, so it looked pretty familiar. A lot of the terminology, kind of the way it broke down, is pretty similar, so I feel like I'm pretty comfortable. But using assessments, all right, so both of these churches that I'm working with are going to want to use the assessment very heavily in their interview process, in their performance process, all those kinds of things. And so it got me kind of thinking about how to accurately bring those into your process. Because I want to make sure that assessments, although they're important, although they're vital, they don't completely eliminate a candidate or a person from the job. Okay. So one of the things I like to say during assessments when I'm doing training, coaching, all that kind of stuff is that anybody can do the job. Okay. Anybody can do the job. Just how they get the job done will look differently. Okay. So let's make sure we're clear on that. Anybody can do the job. Any personality type can do the job, but how they do the job might look differently. They do it through the lens of relationships. They do it through the lens of personality. They do it through the lens of like organization and skill, details, things like that. I shouldn't say skills, sorry. But how they do it will be different, but every personality type can do the job. Just some are a little bit more naturally wired to do it. Some are a little bit more naturally gifted in that area, but everyone can do that. So here we go. So I'm going to give you 5 questions to ask when you're thinking through. Maybe you're interviewing for a job. Maybe you're taking an assessment. You're kind of doing some self-evaluation, self-review. Maybe you're interviewing somebody to hire somebody, right? So here's a couple questions I want you to think through when you are looking at it through the lens of yourself or when you're interviewing somebody else. Okay, so number 1 is this, are they self-aware? Okay, are they self-aware? Or am I self-aware? Okay, so when you look at this assessment, when you get it back, are you aware? Are you aware that you have some strengths? Are you aware of what those are? Are you aware that every strength has some weaknesses? Are you aware of those? Because you need to start with awareness. Okay, you need to start there. Am I aware of my strengths and my weaknesses? Number 2 is this, how do they leverage their strengths? So how do they leverage their strengths, or how do you leverage your strengths? Okay. How do you leverage your strengths? When you look at this assessment, if it's DISC, Enneagram, Strength Finders, Culture Index, whatever it might be, how do you leverage those? How do you get into those personality giftings? How do you take those to the next level, right? How do you do that? Number 3 question is this, how do you compensate for your weaknesses? So every strength has weaknesses, right? So how do you leverage your strengths, but then on the flip side, how do you compensate for your weaknesses? And a lot of this goes back into question number 1, which is, are you self-aware? Because if you don't know that you have weaknesses, you're probably not even compensating for those weaknesses. So we've got to admit, we've got to lean and say, look, some weaknesses. Hey, what's up, Terry? Thanks for joining. So I have some weaknesses. I have some areas of growth. I have some areas where I need help. And so how do you compensate for those? Do you get people around you? Do you bring support staff in, support volunteers in? How do you leverage those? Are you learning? Are you developing in those areas? Okay, so how do you How do you compensate for your weaknesses? Number four is how do you complement, not compete, other personality types? Let me say that again. How do you complement, not compete with other personality types? So you've got a personality type that's really strong in a couple of areas. You've also got some weaknesses. Now, how do you interact with staff that are the opposite? Okay, so for example, my wife and I are always opposite on every personality assessment that we take. Okay, so how do we work together to complement each other, not compete with each other? Okay, so I'm about high vision, high drive, high achievement, high, futuristic. My wife's a little bit more on the steady, consistent, detailed, those types of things. How do we work together when we're like on opposite ends of those to complement each other and not compete with each other? Okay. So you've got to work with people that have different personality types than yourself, or you're not going to make it very far in life. I promise you. The fifth one is this, and this is the biggest one, is what is their calling? What is your calling? Because again, there's jobs that you could look at different assessments and say, man, I just don't think that's a right fit for them. I just don't think that's a natural fit for them to be in that role. But there's always the God card. There's always just that Holy Spirit God card that just makes it work. And that's why I want to come back to every personality type can do every job, especially when they're gifted in the calling of God. And so we can't completely discredit ourselves. We can't completely discredit God, a candidate for a different role. We can't discredit ourselves, because there's always the God card that just trumps all of these other things, and it just supernaturally supercharged past all of those, maybe those weaknesses, and allows it to work. So in your roles, if you're hiring, if you're interviewing, if you're applying, even if you're on staff at a church right now, or a ministry, or a business right now, look at your job and say, what would be some natural giftedness? What would be some natural personality types that would fit this role? That's called job benchmarking. Taking those resume skills, those personality skills, and do it. Look through and say, man, what would be the typical person that would do this job? In the HR department, finance department, what would that be? Youth pastor, small groups director, whatever it might be, outreach director. What would be some of those things? And look at where you're at, and don't get defeated and be like, oh man, I've been give up. Two things. One, maybe it might give you some clarity on why you're maybe experiencing some tension or some frustration. Maybe you're not in the right seat. Number two is maybe it'll expose some things that are weaknesses that you can begin to compensate and say, that's why that part is so frustrating to me. Let me get some people wrapped around to come alongside and partner with me and to complement those and not compete. So I hope that you guys will continue to dive in here. Thanks so much for jumping in. Look forward to seeing you guys again soon.